Good morning, everyone, and a big welcome on behalf of the European Policy Centre to this event, which is being held by the EPC's European Migration and Diversity Programme and the Connecting Europe project, which is a joint initiative by the EPC and Stiftung Mercator. This event is being held in cooperation with the Mercator Forum for Migration and Democracy, MIDEM for short, which is a joint project between Dresden University of Technology and Stiftung Mercator. My name is Petit. I'm a policy analyst at the EPC, and I'll be moderating this hybrid event titled Polarisation and Public Attitudes, Implications for EU Migration Policy. As a brief introduction, growing evidence suggests that European citizens are becoming increasingly hostile towards people who hold views different from their own. Known as affective polarization, this form of hostility has disruptive effects on democracies and their ability to accommodate disagreements. Today, we will be discussing this topic, drawing on a new MIDEM study, which was actually launched officially this morning. You may have seen the QR codes by the door. And although this study covers a number of different topics, we will be focusing during this event, particularly on the topic of migration, which in the study, as far as I believe, is referred to as being the issue area that has the strongest potential for societal division and demonstrates the highest levels of affective polarizations in the member states that were covered in the study. During this hybrid policy dialogue event, we will be reflecting on the implications of increasing polarization for migration policy and discourse in the context of several factors, including the 2024 European elections, its impact on EU decision-making, and the actors and actions that are needed to mitigate its harmful effects. This event actually comes at a really good time because last week, the plenary of the European Parliament agreed to open talks with EU member states on long-awaited reforms to the common European asylum system, which I'm sure we're going to be talking about a lot more later on in the conversation. So first of all, a few words on today's programme to present the study, which looks at growing polarisation on a range of different topical issues, including migration. We have with us at the end of the table, Dr. Maik Herold, Senior Research Associate at MIDEM. Following the presentation of MIDEM's study, we will hear from our excellent panel of speakers, but first of all, from Professor Hans Vorländer, who is the director of MIDEM. And then we have Katarina Barley, who is Vice President of the European Parliament for the S&D Group. We also have Míriam Juan-Torres, who is joining us online, who is the Head of Research of the Democracy and Belonging Forum at UC Berkeley and Senior Advisor of More in Common. And we have my colleague, Alberto-Horst Neidhardt, who is Senior Policy Analyst and Head of the European Migration and Diversity Programme at the EPC. So thank you very much to all of our panelists for joining us and for having accepted our invitation. And after this presentation, we will have a panel discussion with our speakers. And then after then, we will have a Q&A session where we can open the floor and you are welcome to ask any questions. So before handing over to Maik and the rest of the panelists, I will now give the floor for 45 minutes to Professor Hans Vorländer, who will share some brief introductory remarks for us. So.
Thank you very much. I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of you, and it's a great pleasure to be here again. We came here in 2019 and presented a study on the connection between migration and right-wing populism. Now we are back and we are presenting a brand new study, and we are very pleased and feel honored that we could present it right here, and that you all came and were joining us today. And it's a great opportunity to discuss the empirical findings. Thanks so much for organizing it, EPC and the program Connecting Europe. And we are very pleased and we feel honored that the Vice President of the European Parliament is joining us today. And thanks for the attendance and participation of the outstanding experts in this field, Anastasius and Alberto-Horst. Thanks for joining us. Ladies and gentlemen, after 2015, right-wing populism had gained enormous momentum. We could observe that political entrepreneurs, groups, as well as parties, were able to use this strong refugee movement as an opportunity to develop narratives that frames in order to reinforce fears and resentments towards immigration, using the means of stoking emotions and public outrage. These forces succeeded in gaining considerable political momentum. Confrontations, including brutalization, increased on the streets, in parliaments, and public discourse. Since then, immigration has been playing a decisive role when we talk about divisive tendencies in European societies, and also with regard to the cohesion of the European Union. At the same time, we see that it is difficult to formulate and implement a common policy in the European Union that leads to a new migration and asylum regime after the de facto breakdown of the Dublin system. The EU Parliament just made new proposals, introducing several migration and asylum files. But ultimately, it is up to the member states to agree upon and implement them. And as we all know, there might be a resistance there. In the case, let's put it this way, in the case of refugee migration from Ukraine, however, the EU showed decisive and united action by applying the Temporary Protection Directive for the very first time. To this day, refugee migration from Ukraine continues to receive strong support. But the picture seems to be different for refugee migration of third country nationals. With numbers of refugees from third countries rising again, the upcoming EU parliamentary elections and citizens' expectations that the EU should solve the migration problem, migration could once again become an extremely polarizing issue. Is migration really a divisive issue? And how polarized are public attitudes on this issue? In which countries, in which social groups do we observe the highest level of hostility among people with differing opinions today? The new MIDEM study that we are going to present gets to the bottom of these questions. We had developed a new innovative research design called affective polarization and conducted a survey in 10 European countries. In the following, and on behalf of the co-authors of this study, Janine Joachim and Kirill Oteny, Maik Herold will briefly present the results and focus on the issue of migration, but not without answering the overall question, how widespread is polarization in Europe? Maik.
While Maik is getting ready, I'll just quickly give a few notes. So thank you very much for your remarks, Hans. And so I would like to say that this presentation will last around 10 minutes. And after then, we'll move straight into the panel discussion. And I thought I'd take this opportunity to say to the online participants that you can already start asking questions and to use the Q&A to type in your question in the Q&A box. And these questions I can use at the end during the Q&A session to pose to our panelists. So I think that's good. Over to you, Maik.
Thank you very much. Well, to answer this question that Professor Vorländer just raised, we took a new approach measuring polarization by combining methods designed to investigate political positions with those designed to measure feelings and affects, emotions. assessing the affinity or aversion between groups of people that are defined not along party lines, but by their positions on issues. Thus, we understand affective polarization, as you can see on the next slide. Can I could, okay. Yeah, thus we understand affective polarization as the degree of which people with opposing views on an issue are rejected or condemned. High affective polarization indicates high affinity towards people who hold similar opinions and high aversion towards people who have different views on a certain issue. In terms of data, our study is based on a survey conducted in collaboration with YouGov that collected data in the fall of 2022 in 10 member states of the European Union, as you can see on this little map here: Czechia, France, Germany, Greece, Hungary, Italy, the Netherlands, Poland, Spain, and Sweden. Around 20,000 people answered questions relating to a total of 7 different issue areas, like immigration, including immigration, the war in Ukraine, COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, and others. So what are our key findings? First of all, it is interesting to know which issues are the most polarizing. As you can see here, a particularly high level of affective polarization can be observed for the issues of immigration and climate change. Respondents here show the strongest average tendency to judge people who hold opinions similar to their own with a very warm and positive feeling, while expressing very cool and negative sentiments towards opposing views. In contrast, levels of affective polarization are lowest for the issues of gender equality and social benefits and their financing. Apart from measuring effective or actual affective polarization, we were also interested in respondents' subjective assessments of possible conflict potentials and trends towards social division. For this reason, participants were asked whether for each of the 7 issue areas, they saw a, quote, division of society in their own country. And as you can see on this figure here, by adding the light blue bars, immigration, pandemics, and social benefits turned out to be seen as the most socially divisive issues. When comparing this with the actual polarization, the dark blue bars, you can see quite some differences. And by the way, the margin between the 2 bars, the colors of the bars doesn't matter so much, but more the order of the topics. The social benefits issue is perceived as being highly divisive, even if in fact it produces comparatively low levels of actual polarization. On the other hand, the issue of climate change produces strong levels of measured polarization, yet respondents do not identify a strong risk of a, quote, division of society here. In both respects, however, the subjective as well as the object dimension, immigration turns out to be the one issue that shows the most potential for polarization. Therefore, in the second part of my very brief introduction, I would like to make some further remarks on this issue. First of all, it is very interesting here how Europeans position themselves towards immigration in general. In our study, the respondents could express their own position between 2 general opposing statements: immigration of foreigners should be facilitated on the one hand, and immigration of foreigners should be restricted on the other hand. The results, as you can see here, show that political preferences in Europe are clearly in favor of a restriction of immigration. In total, throughout Europe, 55% of the respondents are in favor of restricting, quote, the immigration of foreigners. Only 25% tend to the opposite view. Restrictive preferences are particularly widespread in Czechia, but also in Sweden and the Netherlands, where about 2/3 of the population hold such a view. In Spain, Italy, and Greece, on the other hand, public opinion turns out to be at least a little bit more liberal. A very similar picture was revealed when we asked about the, quote, immigration of Muslims in particular. This is a question which is often used to measure Islamophobia. Across Europe, 57% think that the immigration of Muslims should be restricted. Only 27% reject this view, with respondents in Sweden, Czechia, Greece, and Poland are particularly being critical towards, quote, Muslim immigration. When we ask about Ukrainians, however, the whole picture changed. Here we asked our respondents to what extent they agree with the statement that, quote, refugees from Ukraine can be integrated into society much better than those from the Middle East or Africa. In total, 56% of the respondents more or less strongly agreed with the statement. Only 26% rejected it. Especially in Sweden and the Czech Republic, people hold the view that, quote, Ukrainian refugees can be integrated much better than those from the Middle East or Africa. But how much then is the amount of polarization that is caused in European societies by different views on immigration? Here it turns out that the degree of aversion towards people with different opinions is highest in Italy, but also considerably high in Czechia, Hungary, Greece, and France. In Poland, on the other hand, immigration exhibits the least amount of polarization, which is quite interesting considering the role of Poland in the past decade in the context of attempts to find a common European refugee and asylum policy. Which groups of people then are particularly polarized on the issue of immigration? When talking about different social groups, we found that people in the oldest age group are significantly more polarized than younger people. People with very low levels of educational attainment are more polarized than people with intermediate or high education levels. And respondents in medium or high income groups also express stronger disapproval of people with differing views than respondents with low incomes. When it comes to political affiliations and opinions, however, it turns out that people who describe themselves as being on the right of the political spectrum are on average significantly more polarized than people who locate themselves on the left. Moreover, across Europe, voters supporting right to right-wing parties, as you can see in the picture, appear to be significantly more polarized than supporters of other parties. By contrast, when asked about immigration, not the left, but supporters of Christian, democratic, and conservative parties actually show the least amount of aversion towards people with opinions differing from their own. These and many more results on different issue areas, as Professor Vorländer already said, can be found in our new study, which came out just an hour ago. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for that, Maik. As the study's findings intend to initiate a debate on the consequences of polarization for European democracies and the European Union, we can now move straight into the panel. I'll take this opportunity to kindly remind our speakers to limit their initial remarks to 6 to 7 minutes each, so that we have enough time for the Q&A at the end. So we are very fortunate to have Vice President Katarina Barley with us here today, who I want to thank again for accepting our invitation. Katarina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation and these very interesting findings. Of course, I'm not a scientist. I'm only a lawyer and a politician. So when I look at the results of the study, there are still a few questions that arise for me, and maybe I will start with that. First of all, migration, immigration, refugees, for us politically, these are very different notions. So I find it, a bit difficult, especially if you have a look at Poland, to then gather what what is the reason for these numbers. I must say, from my political experience, I deal a lot with Poland, and I would agree that we have in the population quite a different approach to the question of helping refugees. Now, taking that as one part of migration, than the ruling government at the moment. Even at the height of at the peak of the refugee movements, we had I think 12 or 13 biggest cities in Poland who were all willing to take on refugees who then came from Syria, Afghanistan, that part of the world, and not from Ukraine. And if you remember that the mayor of Gdansk was murdered because Gdansk was one of the cities that were willing to take refugees. So I find this difficult to kind of differentiate between the different forms of migration when we talk about the topic. And the other point is that I'm also a bit, I'm not sure about this notion of polarization either, because now I'm more on the left spectrum, obviously, and I get very excited when we touch upon issues like rule of law, fundamental rights. That's my core field of interest and activity, and has been all my life. So if you say someone gets very emotional towards someone who has a different opinion, when it's on I don't know, saying taxes or whatever, that's one thing. You can have opinions and you can discuss, but when it's on fundamental rights, for example, just take someone who sits opposite of you and says, well, we have to let like a few thousand refugees just drown in the Mediterranean and then it will stop. Is that just an opinion like any other? And when you get upset about it, you're polarizing. I don't know. I mean, I really take very emotionally the stance of rule of law and fundamental rights and independence of judiciary. If you just say, come on, we appoint all the judges, it's just like the Polish and the Hungarian government do. It's our, we have to interpret the notion of rule of law according to our history and culture. That's what they're saying. And for us, this means that, you know, we do it this way and control just about everything. Is that just an opinion? And if you say, look, no, and you are emotional about it, does that mean that you are the polarizing part, you know? And they just sit there and say, I mean, okay, you have a different point of view. That's fine with you. That's the way the discussion really in reality in our parliament is going. And they just sit there and say, that's fine if you think it that way, but we think it otherwise. And we respect that you see rule of law that way, but we see. So is that now me polarizing? Because I see this notion of polarization as something, you know, you're fueling division of society. I'm not sure if that's the case. So I might leave it here. I haven't had a look at my watch. I don't know how many minutes I spent, but just maybe raising these two questions.
Thank you very much for that, Katarina, and I'm sure we'll be discussing more of these points later on in the discussion. And now I will pass the floor to Míriam, who's online, for her opening remarks. Over to you, Míriam.
Hi, and thank you so much. I really appreciate the invitation, and my apologies that I couldn't be there in person. I wish I could, but I'll do my best, and hopefully will keep it interesting. I wanted to start by commending the efforts that were put in creating this report. I think that as someone who's been dedicating her life to research, these kind of like methodological advancements are always very, very exciting. And I think that this report is going to be interesting in many respects. I think that in some ways it's great as an alarm system to see what not only is perceived as a potentially divisive issue, but also the measurements of like along what lines or along what particular issues there's this affective polarization. And I also think it's great to actually be able to see which side is pulling the weight, so to speak, as the report does. So congratulations on that. This is a very difficult question, and I'm sure that we all are participating here, and also the audience know that there's not a simple answer to this. I guess when we are exploring how much polarization is going to be affecting migration policy, what we need to think about is about that policy opinion nexus and whether there is that interplay between the two. And there's evidence, there's a paper that came out in 2022 that does suggest that immigration is a thermostat, or like there's a thermostatic attitude or relationship in between those two. There's this dynamic relationship between public opinion and immigration policy, and a systematic interplay between supply and demand. That being said, is immigration, or is there really going to be a reform of the common European and asylum system and migration policy based on public opinion? And whose public opinion are we going to be paying attention to? I think that there is a lot of factors, and it's very unlikely that it's going to be just a response to public opinion. Obviously, there's a lot of politics to take into consideration, but the challenges ahead are huge. We need to remember first that the migration and asylum policy of the European Union is currently a mismatch of measures on border control, on return, on asylum policy, and on development projects as well. So this really poses a lot of challenges. If we think on migration issues as well, besides or despite the European Union competences, the majority, or if not all, of the European leaders actually work on migration issues looking inwards and looking at national politics. And as this report points to, but as we know from like vast amounts of evidence, there are significant differences between countries, but also within countries, right? So if immigration policy is going to respond to public opinion, the question is to whom? And if there's this polarization, to which side are we going to be paying attention to, or to which side are policymakers going to be responding to? And I think it depends on the policymaker. I think that we need to remember as well the council presidencies. One thing is what Sweden has been doing, and then Spain comes next. But then there's also the interplays with foreign policy as well. Countries like Spain are probably held hostage by the Moroccan authorities when it comes to migration as well. So there's like an interplay between migration policy, foreign policy, and internal policies that mean that this polarization that's being measured on public opinion is not likely going to be the biggest factor in this. We also need to consider salience, but salience of immigrations within a whole, and not just how important people say that migration is to them. So I think that in this sense, there's two factors. On the one hand, overall, given all of the competing priorities that people have, is immigration at the top of the list, or within the three biggest priorities. And there's a range of situations across Europe as well. And I think it was James Dennison and Andrew Giddes that have published some papers as well that suggest that the salience of immigration has been decreasing. And with the cost of living crisis, the inflation, the war in Ukraine, it's also hard to know how the situation is going to go, because on the one hand, there could be far more focus on immigration and on economics in a way that means that immigration is not as relevant as it used to be or as it was in the past. It could also be that if there's higher unemployment or more uncertainty on economic terms, that creates an environment that's ripe for conflict. And in this sense, it's where meaning makers and narratives also play a huge, huge role. And in that respect, I'm not a little bit worried. I'm extremely worried, because I think that the ones that policymakers are responding to are actually the populist far right. How they're framing immigration, the fears that they have that by activating fears and emotions, they're actually managing to attract a lot of the vote. And I think that's the calculation. I know we're discussing European Union and Europe, but I think the British case is emblematic. We are now in a moment when the UK has had the biggest welcoming efforts of refugees, and it's not just about Ukrainians, but also the response, the public opinion response, and the response of the public in welcoming and hosting refugees from Afghanistan as well, or the ease with which population from Hong Kong was also welcomed into the United Kingdom, while at the same time there's the harshest migration legislation and discourse from a British government that there's been in many, many years. So I think it's this populist radical right and policymakers I'm responding to. And then we have the proposals in the new pact, and I'll end here. I don't know how long I've spoken for, But there's the proposal, the new pact, which is primarily rooted in externalization, securitization, returns. And in a sense, I think that it kind of like displays a little bit of a neo-colonial attitude of the European Union towards third-party states. You have those that are bordering Schengen, but then we have Libya, Tunisia, very unstable and volatile situations. But then with third countries, for example, or countries of origins, the attitude, it seems, has been a lot of like, I'll pay you or I'll give you development aid so that you take more migrants, or there's this policy of return. And I'm not sure a lot of countries are going to continue taking that kind of attitude. And I think that the response of a lot of African nations at the General Assembly at the United Nations kind of points to that. There has been less willingness to align with European Union stances. So I think that that reveals quite a lot as well. And finally, on the affective polarization bit as well, I think there's an element that perhaps is missing in our conversation, which is it's not about how important, not only how important a claim it is in one response or how I view others, but also how much that particular topic plays in my sense of self and my identity formation. So thinking about social identity theory. And it seems that in some respects, immigration for a lot of people is not a core element of their identity. And that means that maybe it's not going to be as relevant when deciding in elections or making other sorts of judgments. So I put a lot of things into the table. I'll leave it here and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Míriam. And don't worry, you didn't go over time. It was perfect. So now, just before I pass to Alberto, I would just remind our viewers online, our participants online, that you can ask any questions via the Q&A box. And I would ask that if you do have a question that's for a specific panelist, to mention their name so I can direct it immediately to them. But now, over to Alberto.
Thank you, Perle, and thanks everyone, and to the speakers, of course, for accepting our invitation, and to the authors of the study for presenting it in this context. The study, as been mentioned, is really useful, particularly in the current context. It measures the pulse of the public at the crucial time for European democracies. We all know that migration has really been at the heart of the political debate, particularly here in Europe for the past 7-8 years, and likely, and the study I think provides evidence of these, will also feature quite highly in the debates leading to the next elections of next year. At the same time, I think the study shows quite clearly that the debate on migration remains very emotionally charged. And so I'm going to add 3 considerations to the ones that have already been put on the table connected to these. First, I'm going to go back to narratives and the media and information environment in which people form their opinions. And then I'm going to move on and talk a little bit about the role of public preferences for policymaking, and this is something that was already touched upon as well. And then finally, I will have a few thoughts to share on the new pact and the ongoing negotiation on reform proposals in this area. But I'm going to start from media and information because at EPC we've been doing quite a lot of work on narratives, and we've researched and commented extensively on these. And as the study also notes, it's difficult to draw clear conclusion as to what the drivers of polarization and affective polarizations are, but I think it's impossible to not include the media and information environment in our reflections. And this is because evidently people's views of migration are mediated. They are mediated by the frames that they come across in the news and on social media, by the images that the public comes across, and also by politicians who amplify some of these frames to gain a political advantage and mobilize voters. And in this respect, I cannot but emphasize that we continue to see a dominance of threat-based narratives in the media and information environment, and that we know can make a difference in terms of how people do perceive this issue. Of course, there are exceptions to these, and Ukraine and the response to Ukrainian refugees can also be analyzed from the perspective of how the media responded to it and portrayed it. And I think, again, the role of the media and information environment can perhaps also explain the difference between affective polarization and subjective perception about what are the divisive or the most divisive issues that were considered in the report. And so this raises a number of questions, starting from how to counteract and supplement the kind of black and white frames which are used to communicate about migration. Then moving on to preferences and the impact of preferences on policymaking. Strong views on migration evidently beg the question about the extent to which policymakers should consider public preferences when developing policies. And here I would like to go deeper into the issue without, however, losing sight of the bigger picture as well. And I want to go back to something that Vice President already mentioned, which is we shouldn't ignore or overlook the degree of ambivalence which we always face when talking about immigration. And so when a large share of the population would like to restrict immigration or is in favor of restricting immigration, what exactly are they talking about? What do they have in mind? Do they mean irregular migration or the movement of skilled migrants? Do they mean refugees? And do they always have in mind the same person when they speak about refugees? And so when we talk about individual preferences, these evidently change from one group and another, and in one European locality and another. And we shouldn't overlook these, because when we talk about developing policies, we are not talking about one fit all policies, but we're talking about what kind of policy do we have to have for students, what policy do we have to have for refugees, et cetera, et cetera. I also think that it's important to consider one further aspect when it comes to the bigger picture. First, when it comes to the number of persons who are in favor of restricting migration, true, these outnumber, according to the report, the ones who are in favor or have more liberal views. But then the report also clearly shows that those who hold moderate views or no strong views continue to be the biggest group. And this, I think, is quite important when thinking about how we communicate about these issues, but also what kind of policies the public is in favor of. Finally, still on public preferences. Now, when we talk about public preferences, we should look at these as putting soft constraints on what policymakers can or should do. But there are also hard constraints that we shouldn't forget. Soft constraints, public policy in connection with public opinion, they put some boundaries to what is feasible or not, but these public attitudes, public preferences are also plastic, they change over time, while there are also hard constraints that we shouldn't forget and instead are stable. And here we talk about the legal framework. So you were referring to fundamental rights before. And so when thinking about policies, we shouldn't forget about hard constraints and the kind of limits that these pose. And again, these include the legal frameworks, but they also include other considerations. We can think about economic considerations. We can think about demographic considerations. And I think we shouldn't lose sight of them. Finally, and I'm going to quickly conclude on the new pact. I think for all of those who live in Brussels and probably for those following from online, it's clear that all the relevant stakeholders are under pressure to deliver change in the area of migration policy. And whether the new pact contains reforms which are capable of delivering effective change is something that we can perhaps discuss in another occasion. But I think the clear thing that emerges from the study, which is important in the context of this discussion, is that evidently much of the public will have very high expectations about what the new pact and these reforms will deliver. And so if we consider these and we face a situation where perhaps these reforms are not going to deliver these results, then the question is, how do we manage these public expectations? And do we not face a situation where the public or a large section of the public, in the face of uncertainty and limited results would then demand even stronger reforms in this area. I will leave it to these, and then surely we can go back to these issues during the debate.
Thank you very much, Alberto, and thank you to all of our panelists for these opening remarks. We have approximately 20 minutes or so now for the panel discussion, and so I thought perhaps first we could see what the other panelists think of, if they have any reflections or reactions to the remarks they've just heard. So I think we could maybe start with Hans, if any, or Maik, I'll pass it to Maik for any initial reflections or reactions to what the other panelists have said.
Yeah, thank you. Well, just to pick up a few points that you mentioned of the very interesting remarks that you made. The rule of law and other basic principles, there was a very good question. Are you polarizing when you are defending such basic principles? Well, I would say no, because technically we just ask about issue areas. You know, we're taking on questions that were very that try to that were opposed to each other and try to define the field of a certain policy, like for instance climate change policy or immigration policy, and we only in a very general way wanted people to position themselves in the field and to evaluate other opinions or people with other opinions. The problem with this polarization term is everybody's speaking about polarization if people have different positions on a certain issue, you know, and from a perspective of democratic theory, you could say, well, that's not bad for a democracy because that's diversity, basically, that people have different positions on a certain issue. It is, however, becoming problematic when they, and there's a lot of research around this topic just going on, when they start to hate each other, you know, when they start to not respecting each other anymore in their differing opinions, when it gets emotional, when the own position on an issue like immigration or others are becoming part of their identity and they don't talk to people who have opposing views anymore, and so on. And this is what the core of this concept of affective polarization basically is, and what we try to sort out a little bit, comparing to these ideological differences, which are always persistent in a democracy. On the issue of salience, this is also very interesting questions made by you, Míriam. I have an additional slide on this. I don't know how could I show it. It's.
I think it.
Okay, so we asked also the question: is there a relationship between affective polarization and salience? And the short answer is there is no linear connection. There's no linear relationship between the both. So now it's, yeah, okay. Here we go. This is these are the answers to the salience question. It is actually the case that those people who perceive an issue as being particularly relevant are, on average, more polarized than the others. But on the other hand, those who think an issue is not important at all are also more polarized than the others. So it's like a V. And that's no linear relationship between the both. So salience cannot be just another measure for affective polarization or vice versa. And just to referring to this point with the media that you brought up, Alberto, it's also about salience, but it's also about, let's say, election campaigning. And when you could saw on our slides that Italy is a very interesting case because there is so much polarization seemingly going on in Italy. And this is, of course, due to the case that there was an election campaign in this time period where we went into field work, where we took our survey. So here you can see the polarization in Italy from those people who were asked before the general election in September 22 and after. And you can see that the polarization dropped like a significant amount. which means that in times of electoral campaigning and media addressing an issue, not only the salience becomes higher, but also the affective polarization. Nevertheless, even if we took the lowest value for that, 4.9, Italy still is the most polarized country in Europe. It's just three short remarks on some of your questions.
Thank you very much, and I'll pass straight to Hans.
Yes, thank you very much for the questions. Very interesting points you raised. Let me just address one fundamental problem that was raised by Katarina, Barley, and Alberto-Horst Neidhardt. What we are here presenting is an empirical finding from the point of view of a political scientist or social scientist. So this is not a normative perspective, to say the first. What you quite rightly mentioned, Katarina Barley, is a normative perspective and the perspective of a policymaker. And it's a rights-based approach to the issue of refugees. Quite right so. But it just a fundamental dilemma. You have some empirical findings, and it shows that the issue of immigration is a decisively divisive issue in the public. So, and as a politician and a policymaker, you have to do both things. You have to meet the expectations of the public, of the people on one hand, and they want the political system solve this problem. We all know that you can't solve it because you can't stop migration unless you close all borders and raise fences, but nobody wants it. And on the other hand, you have these divergent, differing opinions, and you have to find majorities, although this field is highly polarized. And this is a fundamental dilemma. So, and as a political consultant or a policy consultant, it's very difficult to handle this dilemma. It's always the same thing with dilemmas. You can solve dilemmas, but you have ambiguities, you have ambivalences. And I think as a politician, you have to address these ambivalences and ambiguities. And one just has to live with those polarized or sometimes divisive political and public attitudes. The problem also is that you always have political entrepreneurs, parties, groups, politicians, and media who frame this issue in a very negative way. So this is indeed a problem of media coverage. It's a problem of the framing as a narrative within the wider public.
Thank you very much. And I think now we can pass to Katarina, who I think looks like she has a lot to say.
Well, I mean, I think this is a good follow-up to what has been said, because indeed the policy maker's view is a very specific one on this whole complex questions. So I would say you can have a polarization either as a result of a sort of a political campaign. I mean, we know that, I can speak best for my home country, for Germany. We know that racism and prejudice towards foreigners, especially foreign-looking people, are highest where you don't find any. Like in the very small villages in some parts of Southeast Germany, you have very high percentages of racism or prejudices, but there are no, if you look at the statistics, there are hardly any foreigners there. So the natural approach probably would be to say it's none of my business, I don't care, but it's not. It's and so that can be the result of fueling fears, And if you talk to these people and you say that, you say, look, but you don't have any foreigners where you live. And then they answer, yes, but we don't want them to come. We don't want to be in the same situation as regions like in Germany, the Ruhrgebiet or somewhere. We just don't want, want them to keep out. So, although probably they wouldn't go there in the first place. So, however, but on the other hand, of course, polarization can also be the result of political developments. If we see that the polarization on this issue is very high in the Netherlands and Sweden, I mean, the Netherlands and Sweden used to be countries that welcomed refugees, that had a very liberal asylum system, for example. And in both countries, we see that we have a certain sort of criminal criminality. That's not an English word. However, that has gone completely out of control. I mean, my husband is Dutch. We spend part of the year in the Netherlands, and in this tiny town where we live when we are there, a lawyer got shot because he defended someone who testified in one of these drug law cases. And that happened. There were quite a few people who were shot in the Netherlands, and I don't know so well about Sweden, but I know that the discussion and the sentiment are similar. So obviously politics did something wrong there, and they did not address a problem that is really there. So that can also be a reason, and I think that is probably the results in the Netherlands and in Sweden, because people usually tend to be very open-minded there. Having said that, with this slide, if you're, I would like to switch to gender issues, which I, in my experience, see it as a field that is very polarized. I was surprised that it doesn't reflect that much in your numbers. Now, if you say that you have this, there are some who say it is not important at all, but it's still polarized. They're not saying it is not important at all. They're saying there is no such thing, or they just deny. If we look at trans persons in Germany, especially the question on language, I don't know how many German-speaking people we have here, but in German you have different forms for nouns, female and male. So, and the discussion is, do you just always use the male one and the female is sort of, implied by doing so, or do you want to make it visible that there are also female persons and others? So there you have people for whom this is really very important and who are polarized in this sense, but you have others. And funnily enough, if you have a look at the Twitter feeds, for example, it's very often those who protest against, who say you should forbid using German words which imply both genders or all the genders. You should forbid those who are very emotional and very polarizing. And it's not because they don't care, it's because they deny. And that denial is just as strong. And then I come to my next point. It's being instrumentalized. I mean, nobody wants to force you to use a certain way of German nouns. It's just that those who want to do it. But that already makes other people completely crazy to just hear it, So to frame it saying we want to forbid to use this sort of language is actually, turning the debate, because nobody wants to impose it on anyone. So that is a way of actually creating a problem that is not really there. At least that's my perception. I'm not neutral, I admit. But what is the problem if I do this and you don't? You know, but they create this discussion about it because identity politics have become a field of politics where you can generate a lot of emotion. And if you take a certain stance where you believe there is the most quantity of voters to win, or the voters that you want to win, you do it. Some do it. And one example maybe for this also is Viktor Orban. I have a very close relationship, which you could call polarized, to him and his politics. And you maybe know that that the Commission is suing Hungary for this LGBTI, this homophobic law. Now, my thesis is that this is exactly what he wants us to do. He does this for us to create this outcry, to then tell his people, look, there's no outcry when we don't have energy, when our inflation goes up, there's no outcry. But when we touch, trans people, or then so this is the decadent West that wants to ruin our traditional family. That's his narrative. And he does that to create this polarization. So, but for us, for me personally, the question is now, what do I do? Internally, we're streaming this, but I will still say it. Internally, what I say in my political group, for example, I'm happily married to a man, but I've always stood up for the community. I will always do. But we have to put it into proportion. We have to be just as loud when it comes to independence of judiciary, media freedom, shrinking space for civil society, all of this. We have to be just as loud, even louder probably. And we are not. We are not. It's the very first time that I think 13 or 14 countries have joined the Commission in suing another member state. And it's on LGBTI rights. Now, don't get me wrong. I said it. I stand up, I go to CSD, I go to everything. But we have, if we do it this way, we will step into his trap. Saying identity policy is the only thing that they care about. They don't care about your economic situation, your whatever, and we should not do this. So this and now solutions. I actually think there are solutions to the migration question. If we talk about refugees now, we need common criteria: who can come and who cannot come, or who can stay and who cannot stay. Let's put it that way. We need a common procedure how to get there. We need a common understanding what happens to people who stay, and we need a common understanding on what happens to people who have to leave. And then we have to just do it. It's not that difficult. And I think countries like the Netherlands and Switzerland have actually shown how it can be. They have a very clear system. They give refugees very good loyal judicial expertise and the lawyer, really good ones, who tell them what is possible and what is not. They have very short delays. Within, I think, a month or two, everything has been clear, and which is good for everyone. They know they can stay, and they can stay and they get the rights, or they cannot, but then they have to leave. I think there's a way of doing this. But as I just said, there are people who are not interested in solving problems, and you have both sides of polarization who profit from the polarization. And sometimes, I would not say in immigration, in refugee questions, you have the extreme right wing, also some of the conservatives, and you have the Greens and some of the Social Democrats, but I think more the Greens, who profit from this. Now, I would never say that the Greens don't want to solve the problem, don't get me wrong. But you see that as long as it goes, those who are moderate, those who are looking for solutions, are not the ones who get the support. It's either or, the more it polarizes. And I think that's the problem, not that there is no solution if you want to find it.
Thank you very much, Katarina. And so now I will pass it to Míriam. And I was wondering as well, after you share your reflections or thoughts on what other speakers have said, but also since Hungary has been brought up and Poland was brought up earlier, with the upcoming council presidencies, how do you see the migration policy debate changing in light of Hungary, then Poland taking the rotating presidency?
Thank you very much. And there's so much to pick up from what everyone has been saying. So I'll try to bring a few things together. And I guess starting with some of Alberto's comments on pointing out to the moderate ambivalent positions, and that this is still the largest group. And I think that that's something that we need to remember. And it would be, I'm pretty convinced that a lot of political actors are responding to how the far right or the populist far right is actually framing the debates. It's far more reactive than it is. I think it will do us a favor as well. It's if we actually thought about the moderate group, the open group as well. It's a larger group of the population of those that have core nativist beliefs. And I think that's something that tends to be forgotten because fear in electoral calculations and so on. More in Common has done a lot of research in terms of migration attitudes and identifying those conflicted middle groups, but also the reality that people have conflicting views themselves. So they might say, no, we don't want to ease pathways to come into the country, or we don't want more migrants. But then there's also high levels of support for regularizing migrants who are not legally in the country, but work in the care sector. And it's a mixed bag of opinions. So I think that it's important to remember that there are many different aspects to migration policy and that we need to look at all of the elements differently. And similarly, I think Alberto was also pointing to that view of who is it that people are thinking about? Is it illegal migrants? Is it legal migrants? Is it refugees or so on? And I think that has a lot to do as well in terms of the framings and narratives in the media and by political entrepreneurs that were being mentioned as well, in terms of who the collective imaginary is. I have deep gratitude for the comments that were brought up by the MEP here present, by Katarina, because she brought up the issue of race and racism. And I know it's something that makes people very uncomfortable in Europe. There tend to be a lot of narratives around racelessness, or we're not the United States. And there's this internalist narrative of Europe as a continent that's different. And then we realize how much particular conceptions on race and racism are deeply embedded in migration policy and also in how people view these issues. I've had, tying it to the collective imaginary of who the migrant is, I've had very interesting focus groups across the continent and in the United States as well, thinking on migration. And to me, one of them is interesting one was with right-wing or bordering far right and some far right participants who were having a conversation on migration, very, very hard, very hate-filled, plethora of hate speech in that particular focus group, which is always hard. But they kept going on about values and Muslims and people of color coming into the country and criminality and kind of parroting a lot of the discourse that we hear from the far right. This was in Spain, no filters. And then I brought up, for example, about Latin American population as well. And they were oh, no, those are not migrants because they're Christian. But then, of course, if you bring some West Africans that are Christian as well, that doesn't seem to play a role as well. Race is very present in the imaginary. And it's also deeply embedded if we think about how a lot of the integration policies are designed in Europe or the European Union or family reunification. Policies that are designed with a paradigm that actually tends to exclude certain groups of migrants, and we don't speak about that as much. It tends to exclude the Muslim majority migrants coming from Muslim majority countries, Africa and Middle Eastern countries. So I think that this is a conversation that we also need to be having, and that as long as we don't unpack in a non-dehumanizing, deep listening manner, how all of this is weaved in, we're gonna continue to have issues. And we're also going to be allowing the populist far right to actually have the loud voice on all of these topics. And clearly the kind of like discourse, the language that is now allowed has the overtone window has moved in terms of like being more openly nativist and so on. And I think that something interesting about this report was what was being mentioned about like the fact that there's no linear relationship between the salience of a particular issue and affective polarization. And then I think that it's also interesting to think about like these salience and who benefits from there being no salience are there being salience. And it's usually like the populist far rights that benefit from the salience. So if it's not salient in a lot of the countries now, then I think like what's the particular relevance nowadays, and like what does this mean for the coming elections in several member states, but then also the parliamentary elections as well. And just to tie back, and I'll end with this, with also Katarina's comments around Orban. The European Union, the institutions, Europe, as a whole, we have allowed and partially financed through the transfer of funds the consolidation of power by Orban. They've complete erosion of the judiciary and the fact that it's now become a competitive autocracy, as we say in political science, or an illiberal democracy, as he says. We know that there's a lot of cross-pollinations between far-right movements, and they use immigration discourse in a very instrumental and I think dangerous and scary way. They are not concerned about using frames that are convenient. And I think that on LGBT issues, it's super interesting in a very scary way as well, how they're using post-colonial discourse or colonial, like anti-colonial discourse to say that this is Europeans coming here to impose their values, because it's kind of like very strange narratives that actually seem to be working. But I think policymakers would do well to think about whose discourse they adopting and mimicking for fear of losing particular constituencies, because what they might be doing simply is amplifying the far right and paving the way for like greater success on that end. And that's particularly relevant when it comes to all of the migration discourse.
Thank you very much. I'll now quickly pass to Alberto before we go to the Q&A session.
Yeah, I'm mindful of the time, so I really want to make sure that the audience and participants can also raise questions. But I'll mention just two quick points, because the impression that one gets when reading the report, and also perhaps from this conversation, is that migration is always a necessarily divisive issue. And I think we have evidence, conflicting evidence about that. And to go back to the question about the response to Ukraine, we have to remember that it was the spontaneous desire of people to help that went to the borders and help those crossing the borders, who put the Polish government in a position where they couldn't but support that overwhelming evidence of solidarity. And so the question for me is, then you need to look in a granular way about where public support stands, and to what extent you can intercept it to make sure that you can sustain policies in these areas. And for example, we didn't really discuss it, but if we accept that there is growing support for more managed migration, one other area where there could be more efforts is in the case of resettlements and resettlement policies, where evidence suggests that people would be in favor, because again, there is a degree to control in the implementation of resettlement policies. And so I think we need to think about also what brings people together, and where there is support for these policies. The second point, very quick, is on the decrease in salience of immigration. There's evidence of these, but also from having worked on narratives and having researched the media and information environment, we also know that there are entrepreneurs, political entrepreneurs, who might try to link some of the other issues which are covered in the report to immigration. And so, to take an obvious example, there's strong concerns about the economic consequences of the war. And because there are growing concerns about economic prospects, there may be a situation where these political entrepreneurs will make a link or draw a link between immigration and the impact of the war on the economy. And so, again, we might see, and there's evidence of these already, a growing dominance of frames of reverse discrimination. And so where the local population is treated unfairly compared to refugees or compared to people arriving from Ukraine, that's an obvious illustration of this. So again, there may be a situation where certain groups will try to push the salience of migration up, even though evidence suggests that overall this is decreasing. But I will leave it to that, and hopefully there will be time also for a good Q&A session.
Perfect. Thank you, Alberto. And actually linking the economic impact you just mentioned, we do have a question from one of our participants online, who's Laura Rayner, who asks, to what degree do you think that public preferences to restricting migration is a result of austerity and its messages of public investments being luxuries that governments can no longer afford? Can we create an environment that gives people a sense of fighting for scraps? Or have we created an environment that gives people a sense of fighting for scraps? And I'll pass that to Katarina for a quick answer if possible.
I think the policy of austerity has had a lot of negative impacts, but I'm not sure when it comes to this question. I would have to think about that. Of course, when I think of housing now, maybe that would sound logical, that the state sort of is restricting its influence on this kind of goods that could be called public goods or health. But I think this is a very, very different perception in the member states. It still is, I would say, on the policy of austerity. Yeah, when I look at, for example, people on Lesbos, one of the places where you have very, very many refugees arriving and the local population having to cope with a lot of changes because of this, even there, and that was after the financial crisis, after austerity, in the beginning, people were very welcoming and supportive to the refugees. It was only after they saw that they were completely left alone, and that, you know, the people there told me the more welcoming we were, the more our impression was that then the other member states said, okay, that's fine, so let them do it, you know. If even Greece, which was probably the most hit by austerity, if even there the original reaction was we have to help people in need where they actually were, and we had an impact on tourism, on prices and whatever. I'm not sure if that is really something that you could a link that one could make.
I would just like to say as well that the audience is allowed to ask any questions. We have a microphone up. I'm already seeing some hands coming up, which is very positive. So actually, due to the time, I will move straight to the first audience question. And if at the beginning you can also state your name, which organization you're representing, and then if the question is directed. So,
good morning, everyone. I'm Matthias Mertens, Communications Manager at the Migration Policy Group. And it's actually from the background of a communications practitioner that I wanted to ask what kind of I'll hold it closer, sorry. So as a communications practitioner, I'd be curious to know if you have any recommendations for comms practitioners based on your research findings. How can we apply research findings in communications work?
I will pass that straight to Maik. That works, and then afterwards to Míriam.
Yeah, okay, we go.
We'll have a second question, and then we can go straight to Maik, Míriam, and then we'll see this out. Are there any other questions from the audience? Okay, I'm seeing over here on the right.
So thank you very much for the debate. My name is Jakub Kaitman. I work in DG Home, also in the communication unit, actually. But I wanted to ask two questions, because first of all, we are here talking a lot about migration, but there is still, and it has been mentioned from time to time, the difference between irregular migration and these pictures of the boats and you know, the migrants arriving to the islands. But you have also this regular migration, and you have, you know, third country nationals who live in Europe, who are contributing to the systems, to our economies, to our society. So the first question is, because we plan as the Commission a communication campaign, this is a result of the conference on the future of Europe, focused on the positive aspects of this regular migration, and we want to target really not the extremes, but really the middle, let's say the movement middle, explained through facts and through the stories on how migration is actually enriching our economy, our society. So do you think that this approach on communication could actually decrease the polarization on the issue of migration, or do you believe that the extreme voices will still be louder than, let's say, the fact-based communication? And the second question is on Ukraine, because we have heard, if I understood correctly, the polarization on the topic of Ukraine, and especially helping Ukrainian refugees, is smaller than the polarization on the, let's say, general migration topic. And also we see other data that attitudes of Europeans towards Ukraine are still that we need to help them and that we need to support them. Can we learn something from our approach towards Ukraine, and especially refugees from Ukraine, and implement that for our approach on general migration? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those questions, and I'll pass it straight for an answer to the first question to Maik and Hans, and also if we could keep the answers quite brief since we're running out of time. And then the second question I will pass to Alberto and Katarina. And the first question also to Míriam afterwards, but I'll pass it across. So Maik, over to you.
So just very briefly addressing some of your questions. Let's put it this way, or follow up on this term of high ambiguity, which is connected with the issue of immigration, which is so true that you mentioned a couple of times. Not only that there is an I told you in my presentation that there's an overall, you saw it also in the figures, that there's an overall opinion on overall trend. People are being restrictive towards the issue or demanding restrictive policies. On the other hand, however, you find also support for immigration, or let's say less polarization in places where or in groups where you wouldn't expect it. Like, for instance, people with low income. People with low income are significantly less polarized than people with high income. What does this mean? It means that they might have a certain position on the issue, but they are not so hostile towards other people who have different positions. But also in terms of the cases, we're talking about Hungary a lot, but what is very interesting is also the case of Poland, which is quite the opposite of Czechia, for instance, two countries that are often put in the same basket, like being the Visegrad group or something like this. So Poland seems to be much more liberal and much more less polarized than we may have thought of, which is also true for the questions about Muslims. I didn't know if you have seen it, but also there, Czech Republic is very critical, but Poland is not. It's quite in the middle somewhere. So you can't say it's just because of the Ukrainians there, and when they think about immigration, they just think about Ukrainians. No, it's also it's more ambiguity on the issue here. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Over to Hans.
The most difficult task is to address the issue of recommendations. But I think we get two lessons out of these empirical findings. One is there are strong concerns about culture. And people make differences between different cultural backgrounds. So, and what we can see in public discourse is very often a discussion about cultural backgrounds. Do they fit into our way of life or our identity and so forth. And the second point is communication in media and political instrumentalization. These are two very important points. How do we get the discourse reframed? I think we should reframe the discourse on refugees and migration. We shouldn't take up the cultural issues. We shouldn't take up the political and instrumentalization issues. What we should do, I think, there could be an approach to stress the pragmatic approaches to get along with refugees and migration dynamics, which means creating regular, safe, and legal pathways from to Europe, to individual states in Europe, within a coalition of the willing who are able to take up the refugees. Two, I think we should try to get done some migration pacts in a bilateral way between different individual European states and transit states, states or countries of origin. Three, I think this is part of the lesson of the Ukrainian refugee accommodation. We should think about temporary protected status. The temporary protection directive, I think, was very, very important. So it gave refugees the opportunity just to have direct access to housing or to the job market. I think this is a very important point. So regular, safe, legal pathways and temporary protected status, and additionally bilateral migration compacts or pacts with countries of origins or transit. So we should reframe the discourse and highlighting the pragmatic solutions to it, and to get away from cultural and ideological discourse. That would be my resume.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And I'll quickly pass to Míriam to ask if you could respond particularly to the first question. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and I think that it builds on the comments that were just being made about reframing, because I think that's very important. But then, like on a more specific notes, and this is coming from research that I've conducted over the years with More in Common. And I'm sorry, this is kind of like just basic, so I don't want to pretend that it's not known already. But there's like the targeting of the audience and really being conscious about like who you're targeting in like those communications, and that you're speaking to their value sets. So taking into account like the competing narratives and which ones are percolating into public discourse, and then like how they resonate with the particular audience that you're trying to appeal to, and like what, as I was mentioning, are their fears, anxieties, and recognizing them. Like painting a rosy picture is also likely not going to resonate with most of the population. Thinking about like how your content interacts with those values, but then also like with the competing narratives as well, like whether it's being reactive, proactive, whether it's expanding the circle of human concern, or thinking through how group identity interplays with all of these usually tends to be quite effective as well, and what elements of people's identities you're touching on as well. And then thinking a lot about not necessarily a binary between fact-based communications and stories, but actually like how to combine both. We know from years of evidence that generally speaking, myth busting, or particularly myth busting on its own, doesn't work. but you can do fact-based storytelling as well. That's likely to be quite effective, and then think through both the images and the emotional resonance of everything that's being put. So there's just a few pointers. I guess I would say, like, it also depends. It depends on the country, the audience, the place you're doing it. So like really unpicking all of that as well is important.
Thank you very much for that. And I'll pass straight to Alberto, particularly for an answer to the second questions, or the two second questions that we had about irregular, regular migration and the question of Ukraine.
Yeah, I'll keep you short so that Katarina can also come in. But very quickly, one of the things I'm always surprised, going back to the first question about the communication from DG Home on this topic, is the very few persons who are aware of the overall numbers of irregular vis-a-vis irregular migration. It's very, most of the people are not aware that most of those who come to Europe from third countries come regularly. And so this is one of the first issues to address. But then it needs to be connected with the question on how do you communicate about this. And I really welcome the efforts, proactivity of DG Home in improving its communication strategy. But I think the key problem there, or challenge, is how do you, on the one hand, speak one voice from Brussels and at the same time take into account the different audiences that we were talking about. And so I'm aware of that challenge, and I can only speak by welcoming the efforts in trying to understand how to best address this challenge. Moving quickly to the question on Ukraine, at the level of the policies, I think the lessons learned are clear. And I think it speaks volumes about how to sustain feelings of solidarity, the fact that people were able to welcoming in their houses those who were fleeing from the conflict, because it's also through intergroup contacts that you avoid polarization, other than the benefits from an integration viewpoint by allowing people to enter the labor market right away. So this part about the policy is relevant. It's also, I think, relevant to go back to something that Katarina was referring to before. We shouldn't forget that back in 2015, initially, the response to the arrival of asylum seekers was overwhelmingly positive. And yet, because somehow this positive and welcoming attitude was taken for granted, then people's concerns were ignored, which led to a fast-paced change in attitudes. And we know what kind of pressures then this led to, and how it provoked or generated a shift in the debate. I think when it comes to Ukraine and the situation that we are facing now, and the other connected issues that we see in migration policy now, this mistake cannot be committed again. We need to think, how do you sustain that level and degree of solidarity? How do you make sure that people do not feel forgotten, those who are on the front lines, really, of this debate and the welcoming efforts?
Thank you very much, and thank you for keeping it so brief. And I'll pass now to Katarina.
I'll try to be as brief. First of all, thank you so much to DG Home that you actually draw practical conclusions from the conference on the future of Europe. I was very much engaged there, and I thought nothing would happen, but this is something. No, I'm serious there. This is something. Second, on Poland, I think this is maybe also an explanation for the figures is, and an explanation then, or an answer to your question would be, make it personal. It could be you. And for Poland, I would have loved to have seen the answers to the same question before Brexit. I think in Poland, this feeling of being discriminated, of being really victim of attacks, being a sort of a caricature of yourself. I mean, these Eastern European workers were really object of hatred in Brexit discussion. Maybe this does something to you. I can only say, me politically, our youth organization, which is, as youth organizations are, more left than we are, worked very well together with an organization in Germany that consists of people or their children and grandchildren who had to flee in the Second World War from Eastern Europe, who are ultra conservative usually, because, this is still Germany, it's not Poland for a long time. So, but these completely different groups merged to support refugees in 2015-16, because they said, we know how it feels. when you have to flee, when you get kicked out of where you are. So try to make it personal. I think might be a way. And also people of low income, maybe they just have more colleagues or people where they live who are also foreigners, refugees, whatever, so that they know these are humans and they're just like us. Maybe that's also an explanation. And the last thing, being pragmatic. I would really love a narrative that frames being pragmatic here as something positive, because at the moment you have the ones who are those who are for the refugees, but then sometimes really lose any sense of pragmatism, which is understandable from a political point of view, because that is what their electorate wants. They really want to be pro at any cost. And you have those who are against at any cost. And then you have those, being myself also, who try to find solutions. But this is sometimes being framed as then either neglecting the rights of refugees or neglecting the needs of your home population. And I think it's the only way of getting anywhere. And that's my last sentence, one possibility, there has been a very good idea of, for example, Gesine Schwan and others, who said give the local communities money if they welcome refugees, and not only the money that they have to spend, but something on top for their own needs, to renovate the kindergarten or whatever. Because at the ground, people, you said it too, people are willing to help, and to frame it as it's good to help. I mean, I'm a social democrat. Solidarity is my core value. We should help. And to show those who do help, they're not the idiots in the end, like the people in Lesbos who end up with all the problems and their tourist region is ruined. They're the ones who profit from it. That could also be a way.
Thank you very much. And although it'd be really nice to carry on discussing this, because I'm sure you all have a lot of questions, we've already run past the hour. So I'd like to say thank you very much, everyone, for attending. Thank you very much on behalf of the EPC. And I would like to thank our panelists and our project partners. So Maik, Hans, Katarina, Míriam, and Alberto, thank you very much for being here. And I'd like to also thank my EPC colleagues, especially Anastasio Carrasas and Felipe and Ataide Lampe from Connecting Europe for helping organizing this event. And apologies to anyone who asked questions, particularly online, that I didn't get a chance to get to. But thank you very much, everyone, for attending. And the report is, as we said, available already as of today. And by the front door, there is a QR code. That means that you can scan it and directly access the report. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for attending. Thank you for speaking, and have a nice day, everyone, and hopefully see you soon.